All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 27, Section 6, China, Japan, and the Western Powers. So we've got a really brief section here, and just to summarize it in short, essentially it talks about China and really their resistance, to, we'll say, Western ideas. Meanwhile, Japan embraced Western ideas and the consequences of each of this. And for resisting, especially industrial technology, it meant that China was certainly in this time period on the decline, right, significantly in terms of their power. Meanwhile, Japan was on the rise. So for China, it had been a pretty tough century. The 1800s, the Taiping Rebellion was one of the deadliest revolts really ever. You could compare it to conflicts like World War I and World War II, even though it preceded that. You had China being taken advantage from outside powers, the treaty ports, or we might call unequal treaties, pretty much forced China to trade with industrial powers like Great Britain, like France, like Germany, like even Japan here, on very much unequal terms. So the problems for China were both domestic with rebellion and foreign. Reformers did seek to try and change China. The self-strengthening movement, this was a reform movement in China, which really sought to adopt Western, what we might call tools, but still, retain Chinese culture. The fear was in China especially is that with outside ideas and outside culture coming in, that would sort of diminish Chinese culture. And so the self-strengthening movement was like trying to get the best of both worlds. It was simply to take in Western learning, Western tools, Western technology, but at the same time retaining this Chinese identity and this Chinese culture. However, though, the empress at the time, Empress Cixi, continued to resist any sort of reforms. One example was her opposition to railroads. We might say opposed by Cixi. So with that, China continued to fall behind. Meanwhile, Japan was on a very different trajectory. Yagamata Arimoto, he was a Japanese, we'll call him an elite, an expansionist. He believed the best way to protect Japan from outside powers was to create kind of like a buffer zone, what he called a sphere of influence. So we might say Japan to acquire territory to protect itself from outside powers. And of course, Japan, what we talked about in a previous section, really embraced these ideas. We talked about the Meiji Restoration and the way that Japan brought in people from Great Britain, brought in people from the US, brought in people from Germany, adopted the style of, Western military, Western Navy, Western industrial technology. And this ended up paying dividends. With that technology, Japan was successful in two conflicts. The first one, the Sino-Japanese War. Sino means China. So China and Japan went to war in 1894. Japan won, and as a result claimed Taiwan. So there's one part of the sphere of influence. Meanwhile, China experienced internal rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, or sometimes called the Boxer Rebellion, was a Chinese rebellion against foreign influence. Unlike a lot of unlike a lot of other internal rebellions before, where typically the empress was on the side of outside powers and really kind of against her own population, the Empress actually supported this rebellion. And it took an international coalition, including Japan, to eventually put down the rebellion. So ultimately it failed. The Boxer Rebellion did. But as a result, Japan was able to take advantage of this. It was amongst one of the nations that helped put down the Boxer Rebellion and even gained more territory. Another conflict where the Japanese expanded their influence was the Russo-Japanese War, 1905. In this, Japan won again and paved the way for annexing Korea in 1910. So with territories like Taiwan, with territories like Korea, the Japanese also extended their influence into China as well. There were some parts of China that were heavily under Japanese influence. What Aritomo called a sphere of influence, really what Japan had done by, at least the early 1900s was to, be one of those imperial powers. When we think about new imperialism and the very few number of countries that carved up, 85% of global territory, they were mainly European countries, but it also by 1910 included Japan amongst those imperial nations.